During the most important night of my career, my husband walked into a crowded ballroom, laughed in my face, and announced he was taking half my fortune and my grandfather's estate. He thought leaving me with $0 in our joint bank account would break me. He had no idea the file I was preparing for the judge would send him straight to a federal prison. My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of an artificial intelligence supply chain logistics firm. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit subscribe and like this video if you believe that karma always catches up to greedy people. The crystal chandeliers of the high-end Manhattan hotel cast a golden glow over the ballroom as my company celebrated its 5-year anniversary. It was a milestone I had bled for, working 80-hour weeks while surviving off cold coffee and sheer willpower. I was seated at the center table, surrounded by my board of directors and our top investors. We were just raising our champagne flutes for a toast when the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. It was Nathan, my husband of 5 years. He was an hour and a half late. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that I had paid for, but his hands were empty. No flowers, no card, no apologetic smile. Instead, he wore a smirk that made my stomach tighten. Nathan was a junior partner at a failing boutique investment firm, a job he kept mostly to stroke his massive ego, rather than to actually contribute to our household. He walked straight to our table, his leather shoes clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. The gentle hum of corporate chatter died down as people noticed his aggressive posture. Without a word of greeting, he reached into his designer briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them onto the white tablecloth right next to my champagne glass. "I am filing for divorce," he announced, his voice booming loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "And my lawyer will be in touch tomorrow morning because I am taking 50% of this little tech startup of yours. Oh, and that sprawling $10 million estate your grandfather left you, I will be taking that too." Gasps rippled around the table. My lead investor lowered his glass and stared at Nathan in absolute shock. The room felt suddenly devoid of air, but I refused to give Nathan the reaction he was so desperately craving. He wanted me to cry, to beg, to cause a scene in front of the exact people I needed to impress. I looked down at the divorce papers, then back up at his arrogant face. The entitlement radiating from him was suffocating. For years, he had belittled my tech background, calling me a boring robot while he played big shot on Wall Street, using my money to fund his lavish lifestyle. "Are you quite finished, Nathan?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady. He leaned closer, resting his hands on the table. "You are going to regret ever making me feel second best, Cassidy. Enjoy your little party while you still own the catering." I did not raise my voice. I simply raised my hand and signaled the head of event security, who had already been hovering nearby. 2 large men in black suits immediately flanked my husband. "Please escort this man out," I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on Nathan. "He is no longer on the guest list." Nathan scoffed, adjusting his lapels as the security guards took him by the arms. "You can kick me out of the hotel, Cassidy, but you cannot kick me out of my half of your life. See you in court." He let out a loud, arrogant laugh as he was marched out of the ballroom. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, leaving a thick, heavy silence at my table. I took a deep breath, smoothed the skirt of my evening gown, and picked up my champagne flute. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen," I said, offering a calm smile to my investors. As I was saying, to the next 5 years of unprecedented growth. They slowly raised their glasses, clearly impressed by my composure, but my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sat down and slipped my hand into my purse to grab my phone, needing a moment to ground myself. The screen was illuminated with an urgent text message alert from my primary bank. I unlocked the screen and read the automated notification. "A wire transfer for $400,000 has been successfully processed. Your joint savings account balance is now $0.00." My breath caught in my throat. That account held the emergency funds for the property taxes on my grandfather's estate and my personal safety net. Nathan had waited until the exact moment he dropped the papers to drain every single penny we shared. He was trying to financially paralyze me before the war even began. But as I stared at the empty account balance, the shock slowly hardened into a cold, calculated rage. I did not stay for the rest of the anniversary gala. I handed my champagne glass to a stunned waiter, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the freezing New York winter night. My mind was racing, analyzing data points and calculating my next move. Nathan, taking the $400,000, was a direct declaration of war, but I needed to secure my physical domain first. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to our Tribeca penthouse. The ride took 15 minutes but felt like hours in the traffic. I marched past the night doorman who gave me a sympathetic nod as if he already knew something was terribly wrong. I took the private elevator up to the top floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I stepped out into the private foyer and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the sleek mahogany door. A red light flashed. Access denied. I typed in my 6-digit backup PIN. Access denied. The smart lock glowed red again, mocking me in the dimly lit hallway. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass panels flanking the door. The interior lights flicked on, illuminating Nathan standing in the entryway. He was holding a glass of scotch, still wearing the custom suit I paid for, and he was not alone. A young woman with long, bleached blonde hair and a tight designer dress stepped up next to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. It was Brittany, a 26-year-old social media influencer I had seen interacting with his Instagram posts. Nathan pressed an intercom button on the wall inside. His voice crackled through the speaker above my head. "Go find a hotel, Cassidy. I changed the master codes on the locks. You do not live here anymore." I stared at him through the thick glass. "You are making a massive mistake, Nathan. Let me in right now." He laughed, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Why would I do that? The lease is in my name. You see, my lawyer reminded me that since I signed the actual rental agreement for this penthouse, I have the legal right to exclusive occupancy during a marital dispute. You are officially homeless. Have fun sleeping on the streets." My jaw tightened. "You put your name on the lease because your credit score was a joke and you wanted to feel like a big man. But I paid the $500,000 security deposit and the entire year of rent up front. I paid for the furniture, the artwork, and the very glass you are standing behind." Brittany giggled, pressing her face near the intercom. "She is so dramatic, Nathan. Tell her to leave before I call the cops. She is scaring me." Nathan smirked. "You heard her, Cassidy. Get off my property." He turned his back on me, wrapping his arm around Brittany, and walked back toward the living room. Most women would have broken down crying. Most women would have banged their fists against the thick, reinforced door, begging for their clothes and a warm place to sleep. I am not most women. I calmly walked over to the velvet bench in the hallway, sat down, and unzipped my designer bag. I pulled out my laptop, resting it firmly on my knees. When we moved into the penthouse, Nathan wanted the most expensive state-of-the-art home automation system on the market. But he refused to pay the ridiculous installation fee, so I coded and integrated the entire network myself. I built the architecture from the ground up, tying the HVAC, security lighting, and locks into a centralized server hosted on my private secure cloud. I opened my terminal, typed in my master developer credentials, and easily bypassed his amateur attempt at locking me out. I hit the command prompt and smiled. First, I targeted the climate control. It was 9 degrees outside. I shut off the penthouse heating matrix entirely and remotely opened all 4 motorized balcony doors, letting the freezing wind whip through the apartment. Then I overrode the thermostats to blast the air conditioning at maximum capacity. Next, I accessed the audio-visual network. I unlinked his phone completely and triggered the emergency fire suppression alarms. A deafening high-pitched siren erupted inside the apartment, accompanied by strobing red emergency lights. Through the glass, I saw Nathan and Brittany sprinting back into the entryway. Brittany was covering her ears, screaming something I could not hear over the sirens. Nathan was frantically tapping the wall console, but the screen was completely dead. The freezing wind from the open balcony was blowing Brittany's hair wildly. They looked absolutely terrified. Nathan yanked the heavy front door open to escape the noise and cold. The second they stepped out into the hallway, I slammed my laptop shut, stood up, and walked right past them. I stepped inside the freezing apartment, pushed the heavy mahogany door shut in his face and hit the manual deadbolt. Using my phone, I restored the heat closed. The balcony doors turned off the alarms and locked the system down permanently. Nathan pounded on the door, but I just smiled and walked to my bedroom to pack his garbage bags. I woke up the next morning feeling more energized than I had in years. After packing Nathan's designer clothes into heavy-duty industrial garbage bags and leaving them with the night doorman, I headed straight to my corporate headquarters. I had a company to run and a Series B funding round to secure. I was sitting at my glass desk reviewing quarterly projections when a loud commotion erupted outside my office doors. My executive assistant tried to intervene, but the heavy double doors were violently shoved open. In walked Jasmine and DeAndre. Jasmine was Nathan's older sister, a woman who believed her marriage to a wealth manager made her untouchable royalty. DeAndre followed closely behind her wearing a bespoke suit that screamed Wall Street arrogance. As an African-American man in the cutthroat finance world, DeAndre loved to remind everyone how hard he worked to get to the top, but he was just as entitled and greedy as the rest of Nathan's family. He carried a thick leather briefcase and a smug expression that instantly made my blood boil. "You cannot just barge in here," I said, standing up and crossing my arms. "This is a private corporate office." Jasmine scoffed, waving her manicured hand around my minimalist workspace. "Oh, please, Cassidy, do not play the high and mighty CEO with us. We are family. We are here to help you fix the massive mess you made last night. Leaving my brother out in the cold was a cute stunt, but playtime is officially over." DeAndre stepped forward, placing his expensive briefcase directly onto my clean glass desk. He popped the gold latches and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy black clip. He slapped the documents down right on top of my quarterly projections. "Let us talk business, Cassidy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Nathan told us what happened at the hotel. You embarrassed him in front of your board, but Nathan is a reasonable guy. He wants to settle this divorce quickly and quietly. No messy public trials, no PR nightmares for your little tech startup. All you have to do is sign these papers." I glanced down at the stack. The top sheet was a property appraisal for my grandfather's estate. I looked back up at DeAndre. "And what exactly are these papers, DeAndre?" "A fair settlement," he replied, leaning heavily against my desk, trying to physically tower over me. "These are appraisal documents for the old estate. We had my firm evaluate the market value. Nathan is willing to take the property off your hands completely. In exchange, he will not fight you for the company equity. He will even let you keep the penthouse. Just sign the deed transfer and we walk away. Think of it as protecting your brand, Cassidy. Investors hate messy divorces. If Nathan goes to the press and claims you financially abused him, your Series B funding will vanish overnight." I reached out and pulled the documents toward me. I did not need to read past the first page to know it was completely fabricated. The appraisal valued my grandfather's sprawling $10 million estate at a measly $2 million. DeAndre had clearly forged the letterhead of a legitimate real estate firm to make it look official. They thought because I worked in tech, I would not understand real estate law. They thought they could bully me into giving up my inheritance to cover whatever massive debts Nathan was hiding. I slowly flipped to the second page and let out a short, amused laugh. "You know, DeAndre, for a wealth manager, you are incredibly sloppy. This appraisal lists the property zoning as commercial development. My grandfather's estate is located in a protected residential historic district. You cannot build a shopping mall on it. And this signature from the appraiser is dated for last Sunday. Appraisers do not work on Sundays. You typed this up in your home office this morning, did you not?" DeAndre's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, straightening his tie. "Do not play lawyer with me, Cassidy. You are a programmer. You do not understand the complexities of asset liquidation. Sign the papers, or Nathan will drag your company through a highly publicized legal battle that will bankrupt you before it even reaches a courtroom." Jasmine slammed her hands on the desk, leaning into my face. "You owe him this, Cassidy." He wasted 5 years of his life pretending to care about your boring software codes. Give him the estate and we will leave you alone to play on your computers. I calmly picked up the fake appraisal documents and dropped them directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder next to my desk. The loud grinding noise filled the office as DeAndre's fake paperwork was reduced to confetti. I looked DeAndre dead in the eyes. I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I certainly do not negotiate with frauds. If Nathan wants the estate, he can ask the judge for it himself. Now get out of my office before I have security physically throw you into the street. I reached under my desk and firmly pressed the silent alarm. Jasmine let out a sharp gasp as the shredder ground the appraisal into strips. She slammed her hands onto my glass desk. "You are delusional, Cassidy," she hissed, her voice rising. "You think you are brilliant sitting up here with your servers. But you are just an emotionless tech robot. That is why Nathan is leaving you. You do not know how to be a real wife. You do not understand family loyalty. You just process data like a machine." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my posture relaxed. If being a real wife means letting my husband steal my inheritance to cover his gross incompetence, then you are absolutely right, Jasmine. I am failing miserably. And as for family loyalty, I find it fascinating that your version involves committing federal wire fraud by forging real estate appraisals. His face flushed a dangerous shade of red. The cool Wall Street persona he tried to project was crumbling. He grabbed the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. "You listen to me, you arrogant little girl," he barked, spraying saliva onto the glass. "You do not understand the forces you are playing with here. Nathan is not just asking for a favor. He needs that property right now." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Need is a very strong word, DeAndre. Why exactly does a junior partner at a boutique investment firm need a $10 million historic estate so desperately?" DeAndre slammed his fist against the glass. "He is bleeding capital, Cassidy," he screamed, his composure entirely shattered. "If Nathan does not get that estate to use as collateral by the end of the month, the feds are going to audit his whole firm. And if they look at the books, we are all going down." The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning vent. Jasmine slowly turned to look at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute horror. DeAndre froze, his chest heaving as the reality of what he had just screamed into a room with security cameras finally registered in his brain. He had just confessed to a massive financial crime. The puzzle pieces instantly snapped together in my mind. Nathan taking the $400,000 from our joint account was not just about spiting me. He was desperate for liquid cash. He and DeAndre were running a scheme at their firm. The federal government was closing in, and they needed my grandfather's estate to secure a fraudulent loan to cover their tracks. They were cornered rats. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "Well, DeAndre," I said softly, "that is certainly an interesting piece of information. I am sure the Securities and Exchange Commission will find it fascinating." DeAndre lunged across the desk, his arm outstretched to grab me. Before his fingers could brush my blazer, the heavy office doors flew open. Two of my security guards rushed into the room. "Grab him," I commanded, pointing straight at DeAndre. One grabbed DeAndre, twisting his arm behind his back, while the other stepped between me and Jasmine. "Get your hands off me!" DeAndre yelled, struggling fruitlessly. "I will sue you for assault!" Jasmine was shrieking, swatting at the guard with her designer handbag. "Take them to the freight elevator," I told the guards. "Do not let them use the main lobby. And if they step foot here again, call the police." I watched in silence as the guards dragged the kicking and screaming couple out of my office. Jasmine's high heels scraped violently against the hardwood floor. DeAndre was still shouting legal threats, but his voice grew fainter as the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. Once I was alone, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a sharp, focused clarity in its wake. Nathan thought he could blindside me with divorce papers and intimidate me into giving up my grandfather's legacy. But he had made the fatal flaw of sending his panic-stricken brother-in-law to do his dirty work. They had underestimated my intelligence. I walked back to my desk, and unlocked my encrypted computer. I did not need to cry over a broken marriage anymore. I opened a secure browser window and typed the web address for a private investigator I often used for corporate background checks. Nathan was terrified of a federal audit. I just needed the hard evidence to prove it. I began drafting an email authorizing a full deep dive into Nathan's firm. Every transaction, every offshore account, every hidden asset. The war had officially shifted from a domestic dispute to a corporate takedown, and I was holding the launch codes. I hit send on the email to my private investigator and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of my office wash over me. But the peace was short-lived. By noon the next day, Nathan and his family realized they could not bully me in person or legally intimidate me with forged documents. So they changed their battleground to the only arena where they held any power: the internet. My phone started buzzing relentlessly during a working lunch with my lead engineers. It was my head of public relations. She did not even say hello when I answered the call. She just told me to drop whatever I was doing, open TikTok immediately, and check the link she had just sent me. I tapped the message, and there was Brittany. She was sitting on the floor of what looked like a cheap motel room, wearing no makeup and an oversized faded sweater. She was sobbing uncontrollably into the camera, her mascara running perfectly down her cheeks. The video was heavily edited, with slow, sad acoustic music playing in the background to maximize the emotional manipulation. She claimed she was living in absolute constant fear. She cried to her followers, saying she and her loving boyfriend were violently and illegally thrown out into the freezing New York winter by a psychotic, abusive older tech CEO. She never explicitly said my name, but she dropped enough highly specific hints about my artificial intelligence supply chain company that anyone with a basic search engine could figure it out in seconds. She called me a jealous monster who maliciously manipulated smart home technology to torture them physically, freezing them out of their own home. She held up her phone to show a screenshot of the temperature dropping in the penthouse, conveniently leaving out the fact that they had broken in and changed my locks first. The video already had 4 million views and hundreds of thousands of comments. Teenagers and young adults were tagging my company, demanding I be held accountable for abusing a young, helpless influencer. The comments were ruthless. People were calling for a total boycott of my supply chain logistics firm, which would have been hilarious if it was not actively destroying my professional reputation. They were leaving one-star reviews on our corporate pages and harassing my employees online. Within an hour, the real corporate fallout began. My inbox flooded with emergency meeting requests from stakeholders. My lead investor, the exact same man who had watched Nathan throw the divorce papers on my table the night before, called my personal cell. He was panicking. "Cassidy," he said, his voice tight with anxiety, "our board is getting hammered on every social media platform. We have strict ethical clauses in our term sheets. I know your husband is unhinged, but the public does not know that. They just see a wealthy tech CEO abusing a crying girl. If this PR nightmare is not entirely contained by tomorrow morning, the partners are pulling out of the Series B funding round. We cannot be associated with this kind of messy domestic toxicity right before we go public." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I understand your concerns," I told him. "Give me 24 hours. I will handle it, and the funding will remain secure." I hung up the phone and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, looking down at the busy Manhattan streets below. My chest tightened with a cold fury. Nathan was brilliant in his own sociopathic way. He was using Brittany's gullible followers as a weapon to attack my life's work. He knew my company was my most vulnerable asset right now. If the funding fell through, I would have to lay off half my engineering team and halt all our expansion plans. He was trying to drain my corporate resources and destroy my public image, so I would be forced to hand over my grandfather's estate just to make the harassment stop and keep my business afloat. They wanted to play in the mud. I realized then that taking the high road and issuing a sterile corporate press release, drafted by lawyers, would do absolutely nothing. The internet did not care about corporate statements or legal truths. They cared about drama villains and receipts. If I played defense, I would lose my company. I needed to fight dirty, and I needed to do it immediately. If Brittany wanted to play the helpless victim of financial abuse, I was going to give her massive audience the exact truth about where her luxury lifestyle really came from. I picked up my phone and called my private investigator. I told him to expedite the financial background check on Nathan, but to specifically isolate every single credit card transaction linked to Brittany over the last 6 months. I did not just want to clear my name, I wanted to completely dismantle hers. By late that afternoon, my private investigator delivered exactly what I needed. The encrypted file landed in my inbox containing a comprehensive breakdown of Nathan and his mistress's recent financial activities. I locked my office door, poured myself a glass of water, and opened the spreadsheet. I expected to find that Nathan had been funneling his firm's money or taking out secret loans to fund Brittany's lavish influencer lifestyle. What I found was so much worse and so much more pathetic. Nathan had not used his own money at all. The forensic accounting trail showed a direct link between the purchases of Brittany's brand new Porsche, her custom diamond jewelry, and her endless collection of imported designer bags to a series of high-limit credit cards. But the name on those cards was not Nathan. It was Martha, his 72-year-old mother. I stared at the screen, tracing the dates and amounts. Martha had spent 40 years working as a public school administrator, saving every penny for a comfortable retirement. Nathan, as her golden child, had convinced her to grant him full power of attorney over her finances a few years ago, claiming he could use his Wall Street expertise to grow her portfolio. Instead, he had systematically drained her entire life savings and maxed out multiple credit lines in her name, just to impress a 26-year-old girl he met on the internet. It was the perfect weapon. I did not call my public relations team. I did not draft a polite corporate response asking for privacy during a difficult time. Instead, I pulled an old scrubbed laptop from my tech closet and routed my connection through a secure, untraceable offshore server. I spent the next hour compiling the most damning pieces of evidence. I took screenshots of Brittany's most popular posts, the one where she bragged about her $90,000 sports car, the one where she showed off a closet full of luxury handbags. Beside each photo, I placed the corresponding credit card statement showing the exact date of purchase, the exorbitant price tag, and the name Martha clearly printed at the top, alongside her drained retirement account balances. I redacted Martha's account numbers and personal contact information to protect the elderly woman from identity theft, but I left the financial devastation entirely visible. I bundled the images into a digital dossier and drafted a short anonymous message. The title of the email was simple: The Real Victim of the Tech CEO Divorce Drama. I attached the files and hit send, blasting the package directly to the top 5 largest drama and gossip channels on YouTube, along with the most notorious tea pages on TikTok and Instagram. These were platforms with audiences in the millions, creators who thrived on exposing fake influencers. Then I closed the laptop, wiped the drive, and waited. It took exactly 45 minutes for the internet to catch fire. A massive YouTube creator with 6 million subscribers dropped an emergency broadcast video analyzing the leaked documents. Within minutes, the hashtag exposing Brittany was trending worldwide. The same teenagers who had been harassing my company's pages just hours earlier completely shifted their rage. I pulled up Brittany's TikTok page and watched the destruction in real time. The comments section on her crying video transformed into an absolute war zone. Users were flooding her page, demanding to know why she was driving a car bought with an elderly woman's stolen pension. They called her a gold digger, a fraud, and a parasite. Brands she had sponsored started publicly severing ties with her, in the comments announcing they were canceling her contracts immediately. My phone rang. It was my lead investor again. This time he sounded breathless but relieved. "Cassidy," he said, "I just saw the news breaking online. The heat is completely off us. Everyone is focused on your husband and that girl. The board is satisfied. Your Series B funding is entirely secure." I thanked him, hung up, and smiled. Brittany had wanted an audience and I had given her one. She had built her entire online persona on the illusion of being a wealthy independent model, and now the entire world knew she was just a thief, living off a stolen retirement fund. She had tried to destroy my professional empire, but she forgot that I built systems for a living. I knew exactly how to dismantle a network. Nathan was officially radioactive. He could not show his face in public without being branded an elder abuser and a fraud. But I knew his family. I knew their deep-rooted narcissism and their desperate need to maintain control. They would not accept defeat gracefully. They would try to corner me again, and I was ready for their next move. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I had not seen in months. It was Martha. Nathan's mother sounded exhausted, her voice trembling as she asked if I could please come over to her house for a quiet family dinner. She said she wanted to mediate a peace treaty between Nathan and me. She swore Nathan was ready to apologize and handle the divorce like an adult. She sounded so sincere and completely oblivious to the massive digital bomb I had just detonated online. I knew Martha did not check the internet, much less YouTube drama channels, so she had no idea her precious son had stolen her retirement funds to buy designer handbags for a 26-year-old influencer. I also knew this dinner was an obvious trap, but I agreed to go anyway because I needed them in one room for my next move. I arrived at Martha's modest suburban house right at 7 o'clock. There was no smell of roasting chicken or baking bread. The house was completely silent. Martha opened the front door looking incredibly nervous and immediately ushered me into the formal dining room. She did not make eye contact. I stepped into the room and heard the heavy doors slide shut behind me, followed by the distinct click of a lock. Martha had locked me inside. Sitting around the long oak dining table were Nathan, Jasmine, and DeAndre. They looked exactly like a firing squad waiting for a prisoner. Nathan had dark circles under his eyes. He had clearly seen the internet fallout, but instead of showing remorse, his face was twisted with desperate rage. He had lost the public relations war, and now he was dangerously cornered. Jasmine sat with her arms crossed glaring at me, while DeAndre drummed his fingers on top of a thick stack of legal documents resting in the center of the table. "Have a seat," Cassidy DeAndre commanded, pointing to the single empty chair opposite them. "We are not leaving this room until we reach an understanding." I remained standing, keeping my distance from the table. "I do not take orders from you, DeAndre," I said calmly. "And locking someone in a room is a serious crime in this state. It is called false imprisonment." "Nobody is imprisoned," Jasmine sneered, rolling her eyes. "My mother just wanted us to have some privacy." "We know what you did online, Cassidy. You think you are so clever destroying my brother's reputation with those leaked credit card statements? You think turning the internet against him gives you the upper hand. But the internet does not govern the legal system." Nathan slammed his fist on the table, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You ruined my life," he shouted. "My firm has put me on administrative leave because of the calls flooding their switchboard. Brittany left me an hour ago because all of her sponsors dropped her. You took everything from me. You took everything from yourself, Nathan," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "I simply provided the receipts. You stole from your own mother to fund a pathetic fantasy." DeAndre held up a hand, silencing Nathan. He slid the thick stack of papers across the table toward me. He reached into his jacket, pulled out an expensive pen, and placed it on top of the documents. "This is a post-nuptial agreement," DeAndre said, his tone shifting to a menacing whisper. "We had a team of aggressive lawyers drafted overnight. It states that you willingly transfer the deed of your grandfather's estate to Nathan as a penalty for marital defamation. It also signs over 30% of your company's voting shares to him." I looked at the papers and let out a short, genuine laugh. "You cannot force someone to sign a post-nuptial agreement under duress, DeAndre. Any judge would throw this out in 5 seconds. It is completely illegal." DeAndre smiled a predatory grin. "Oh, it might be thrown out eventually. But do you know how long that will take, Cassidy? 5 years. 5 years of relentless, brutal litigation. We will bury your tech company in discovery motions. We will subpoena your investors, your board members, and your clients. We will freeze your corporate assets during the dispute. By the time a judge finally throws this document out, your Series B funding will be long gone and your company will be bankrupt. Nathan leaned forward, a vicious look in his empty eyes. Sign the paper, Cassidy. Give me the estate and the shares, or I swear to God I will drag your precious company through 5 years of legal hell. I have nothing left to lose, but you have everything to lose. Just pick up the pen and make this nightmare end for yourself. I stared at the pen resting on top of the ridiculous post-nuptial agreement. I did not reach for it. Instead, I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I placed it gently on the table right next to their extortion papers. I did not look at Nathan. I looked directly at DeAndre. You know, DeAndre, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational murmur. You keep throwing the word litigation around like it is a magic spell. You threaten me with discovery motions and corporate audits. But the problem with opening up someone else's financial life is that they get to look right back into yours. DeAndre narrowed his eyes, his jaw tight. What are you talking about, Cassidy? Stop stalling and sign the paper. I tapped the screen of my tablet. It glowed to life, illuminating the dim dining room. I opened a highly encrypted folder and spun the device around so it faced DeAndre. I spent the last 48 hours running a deep data trace on your wealth management firm, DeAndre, I explained, resting my hands on the table. When you screamed in my office about the feds auditing Nathan's accounts, you made me curious. So I had my engineers deploy a predictive algorithm to scrape public filings, offshore shell registrations, and anonymous whistleblower forums. Do you want to know what my software found? DeAndre looked down at the screen. The color immediately drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen. His breathing hitched. Jasmine leaned over, trying to see the screen, but DeAndre snatched the tablet up, clutching it to his chest as if trying to hide a bomb. What is it? DeAndre, Jasmine asked, her voice suddenly wavering with uncertainty. I will tell you what it is, Jasmine, I said, keeping my eyes locked on DeAndre's terrified face. It is an active investigation file from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It details how your husband's firm has been executing illegal crypto margin calls for the past 18 months. When the crypto market crashed, DeAndre and his partners panicked. Instead of reporting the losses, they started illegally co-mingling funds, using new client deposits to cover the massive deficits in their offshore accounts. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the SEC has been quietly building a federal case against him since October. The dining room was dead silent. Nathan looked confused, his brow furrowed as he tried to process the financial jargon. DeAndre was perfectly still. The arrogant, aggressive wealth manager from 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. He was replaced by a man staring down the barrel of a 10 to 15-year federal prison sentence. You hacked a federal database, DeAndre whispered, his voice cracking. That is a crime. I smiled, a cold, humorless smile. I did not hack anything, DeAndre. My AI software simply connected the digital footprints your sloppy accountants left behind on the dark web. I have the ledgers. I have the hidden wallet addresses. I have the names of the clients you defrauded. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. The scraping sound echoed in the quiet room. I leaned over the table, getting inches from DeAndre's face. Here is my counter-offer, DeAndre. You take this fake post-nuptial agreement and you throw it in the fireplace. You stop threatening my company. You stop harassing my investors. If you push me, if you try to take one single share of my tech firm or 1 square foot of my grandfather's estate, I will send this entire unredacted folder to the district attorney, the SEC, and the FBI. I will personally ensure you spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. DeAndre swallowed hard. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to set the tablet back down on the table. He looked at the post-nuptial agreement, then looked at me. He knew I had him by the throat. Okay. He breathed out, his voice barely audible. Okay, Cassidy. We are done. What are you doing? Nathan shouted suddenly, slamming his hand on the table. Make her sign the paper, DeAndre. You said we had her cornered. You said her investors would force her to settle. Do not let this tech bitch bluff you. Nathan's sheer ignorance was almost laughable. He was so completely consumed by his own narcissism and his desperate need for my money that he could not see the absolute terror radiating from his own brother-in-law. He did not understand that DeAndre's life was currently disintegrating right in front of him. "Shut up, Nathan," DeAndre snapped, standing up abruptly. His chair tipped over, crashing onto the hardwood floor, but he did not bother to pick it up. "Just shut your mouth, the deal is off. We cannot fight her on this." Jasmine stood up, grabbing DeAndre's arm. "DeAndre, what is going on? What did she show you?" "We are leaving," DeAndre said, ignoring his wife and backing away from the table. He looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and absolute fear. "Keep your company, Cassidy. Keep your estate. Just delete that file." Nathan lunged forward, grabbing DeAndre by the lapels of his expensive suit. "Are you crazy? If I do not get that estate to use as collateral, my creditors are going to break my legs. You promised me you would handle her." DeAndre forcefully shoved Nathan away, smoothing his jacket with trembling hands. "Handle your own mess, Nathan. I am not going to prison for you." I picked up my tablet and slipped it back into my tote bag. I looked at Nathan, who was standing there red-faced and hyperventilating as his only leverage walked out the dining room door. The trap was perfectly set, and the rats were officially turning on each other. Nathan was officially a desperate drowning man, grasping at tiny straws. Desperate men always make predictable mistakes. He avoided traditional banks. Legitimate institutions require physical presence and notarized signatures. But Nathan did not have time for bureaucracy. His underground creditors threatened violence if he did not cover his deficits. He needed liquid cash immediately, and he was willing to do anything to get it. My private investigator provided real-time updates. Nathan walked into a rundown building in the garment district. He visited a notorious private lender. These were men who did not care about pristine credit scores or proper legal notarization, as long as they had a highly valuable physical asset to place a heavy lien against. In this specific case, the asset he was offering up was my grandfather's $10 million historic estate. I sat alone in my quiet penthouse office, sipping hot black coffee and watching the live feed of data flowing across my encrypted monitors. My loyal private investigator was incredibly thorough and had managed to slip a microscopic listening device into the lining of Nathan's designer briefcase earlier that week. I put in my wireless earpiece and listened intently to the live audio feed transmitting from the lender's office. The audio was slightly muffled, but I could clearly hear the rough voice of the private lender sliding a thick stack of heavy paper across a wooden desk. The lender told Nathan in a gruff tone that he could authorize a $3 million short-term loan immediately. However, he explicitly stated that both spouses absolutely had to sign the collateral agreement since the property was currently listed as a marital asset under our joint financial umbrella. Nathan did not hesitate for a single second. I heard the distinct scratch of a heavy fountain pen pressing aggressively against paper. Nathan smoothly lied to the lender, claiming that I had already reviewed and signed my designated portion of the documents at home that morning. He was actively forging my signature on a federal loan document. He was tracing my name, deliberately committing a felony-level fraud just to save his own skin. He was so blinded by panic and greed that he did not even consider the legal ramifications of what he was doing. At that exact second, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on my glass desk. It was an automated high-priority notification from my premium credit monitoring service. A hard inquiry had just been placed on my social security number by an unregistered financial entity. I unlocked my phone and opened the alert. The digital notification detailed a pending $3 million mortgage lien against the deed of my grandfather's estate. The security system prompted me to verify if I had personally authorized this massive financial transaction. I stared at the flashing red notification on my screen. All I had to do was click the decline button, and the massive loan would be instantly flagged and blocked by the credit bureaus. Nathan would be thrown out of the private lender's office empty-handed and completely out of options. But I did not click decline. If I stopped him now, he would just find another sneaky way to slither out of his debts. I needed him to complete the crime. I needed the ink to dry and the wire transfer to initiate. In the state of New York, forging a spouse's signature on a multi-million-dollar real estate document elevates the act from a simple domestic dispute to criminal wire fraud and grand larceny. By letting him take the dirty money, I was happily letting him weave his own legal noose. I smiled and firmly pressed the accept button on my phone, approving the credit check. Through the earpiece, I heard the private lender confirm that the credit check had successfully cleared. He told Nathan the $3 million would be wired to his offshore account within 24 hours. Nathan let out a loud, dramatic breath of absolute relief. He actually laughed. He thanked the lender profusely, his voice dripping with his usual arrogant confidence. He honestly thought he had just outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully bypassed my security, stolen the equity from my grandfather's legacy, and saved his own miserable life. He walked out of that dingy office believing he was a brilliant Wall Street genius who had finally won the war against his tech robot wife. I took the earpiece out and set it down on my clear glass desk. A profound and deeply satisfying sense of calm washed over me. Nathan had just handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy him. The trap was no longer just set. The steel jaws had officially snapped shut around his ankle, and he did not even realize he was bleeding yet. The next morning, I texted Nathan to meet me at a busy midtown coffee shop. I told him to bring DeAndre. I needed a public neutral ground where they would feel confident but not aggressive enough to cause a physical scene. Before leaving my penthouse, I spent 20 minutes carefully curating my appearance. I usually wore sharp, tailored blazers and immaculate makeup, but today I needed to look like a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I washed my face completely bare, pulled my hair into a messy, loose knot, and put on a baggy gray cashmere sweater. I even skipped my morning coffee so I would look naturally exhausted. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Nathan and DeAndre were already sitting at a small corner table near the window. The smell of roasted espresso beans and burnt milk filled the air. Nathan was wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin. He was undoubtedly riding high on the adrenaline of securing that illegal $3 million wire transfer the day before. He thought he was flush with cash and completely invincible. DeAndre looked much more tense, his eyes darting around the room, clearly still terrified of the SEC file I possessed. I pulled out the metal chair and sat down heavily, letting out a long, weary sigh. I did not order a drink. I just folded my hands on the table and looked down at the scratched wood. "What do you want?" Cassidy Nathan asked, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I am a very busy man today." I kept my voice low and let a slight intentional tremor slip into my words. "I want it to stop, Nathan. All of it." DeAndre leaned forward cautiously. "Define all of it, Cassidy. Are we talking about the divorce or the digital threats you made at my mother-in-law's house?" "Both," I whispered, rubbing my temples as if I had a blinding migraine. "I cannot fight you guys anymore. My board of directors had an emergency meeting last night. Even though the internet turned on Brittany, the investors hate the ongoing drama. They hate the instability. They told me that if I am dragged into a messy, protracted divorce settlement, they might pull their equity and force me to step down as CEO. I cannot lose my company. It is all I have left." Nathan leaned across the table, a nasty, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I told you that you were out of your league. You thought you could freeze me out of my own penthouse and ruin my girlfriend online without consequences. But you are just a weak little programmer, Cassidy. You do not have the stomach for a real war." I forced my eyes to well up with fake tears. "You are right," I conceded softly. "I do not have the stomach for it." "So you win, Nathan." DeAndre narrowed his eyes, studying my face. "What exactly are you offering?" I took a shaky breath. "We have our official mediation scheduled for tomorrow morning with the lawyers. If you agree to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and finalize the divorce immediately, without touching my company shares, I will surrender my grandfather's estate to you. Full legal transfer of the deed. You can have the $10 million property. Just please leave me and my business alone." Nathan let out a loud, booming laugh that caused several people in the coffee shop to turn and stare. "I knew you would break. he mocked, pointing a finger at me. You always were too fragile when things got difficult. You are handing over $10 million just so you do not have to deal with the stress. That is pathetic, Cassidy. It really is. DeAndre, however, looked slightly suspicious. Why the sudden change of heart? He asked, his eyes narrowing. 2 days ago you were ready to send me to federal prison. Now you are just handing over the crown jewel of your family portfolio. Because 2 days ago I thought I could manage the fallout. I lied, my voice cracking perfectly. But I cannot. The lawyers say fighting you over the estate will take years and cost millions in legal fees. I am exhausted, DeAndre. I just want my freedom back. Take the property. Nathan clearly needs the money more than I do anyway. Nathan scoffed, brushing off the insult. Oh, I will take it. And I will probably sell it to a commercial developer by the end of the month, just to pave over your precious grandfather's memories. Make sure your lawyer has the transfer documents ready tomorrow morning, Cassidy. If you try to pull a fast one, I will take the company too. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes cast downward. I will have the papers ready. Just be there. Nathan stood up, adjusting his expensive jacket, and walked out of the coffee shop without another word. DeAndre lingered for a second, giving me a long, hard look, before following his brother-in-law out the door. The moment they stepped onto the sidewalk, my slumped shoulders instantly straightened. The fake tears vanished completely. My posture returned to its usual sharp, commanding stillness. Manipulating a narcissist was incredibly easy once you learned to feed their delusions of grandeur. I pulled out my phone and texted my corporate attorney a single sentence. The bait has been swallowed, prepare the trap for tomorrow. The next morning, the sky over Manhattan was a heavy, overcast gray, reflecting the cold, sterile atmosphere of my attorney's conference room. I sat on one side of a massive mahogany table with my corporate lawyer, Mr. Campbell. He was a ruthless legal strategist who knew exactly how to execute the trap we had laid. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy enough to choke on. Across the table sat Nathan, looking like he had already won the lottery. He was flanked by his aggressive divorce attorney and DeAndre, who had tagged along to ensure the estate transfer went smoothly so their federal crimes would remain buried. Nathan did not even wait for the lawyers to exchange pleasantries. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and immediately began making his demands. He told Mr. Campbell that he was not walking out of this building without the deed to the estate and 50% of my tech company. He claimed that because I had embarrassed him publicly and locked him out of his own penthouse, he was entitled to maximum compensation for his emotional distress. He was so incredibly arrogant, completely blind to the fact that he was walking straight into a legal slaughterhouse. I kept my eyes downcast, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated wife. I reached out and gently touched Mr. Campbell's arm. Just give him the estate, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly for effect. I cannot afford to lose the company. My investors are breathing down my neck. Please just make the divorce stop so I can go back to work. Mr. Campbell nodded solemnly, playing his part to absolute perfection. He looked across the table at Nathan and his lawyer. My client is willing to make a significant concession today to expedite the dissolution of this marriage. Mr. Campbell stated, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. She will legally yield all rights, title, and interest in her grandfather's estate to Nathan. She will not fight for the property. In exchange, Nathan will immediately drop any and all claims to her corporate shares and the Tribeca penthouse. Nathan scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. I told you she would fold, he whispered loudly to DeAndre. He looked at me with pure contempt. You should have just done this in the first place, Cassidy. It would have saved us both a lot of time. Now hand over the deed. Mr. Campbell opened a sleek leather folder and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany table. This is the transfer agreement, Mr. Campbell explained smoothly. It legally binds my client to yield the property to you. However, because this is a rapid transfer of a highly valuable asset, there is a specific liability clause attached. We must ensure a clean break financially and legally. Nathan's lawyer picked up the document and began scanning the first page. What kind of liability clause? He asked, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Mr. Campbell folded his hands on the table. It is standard language for an estate of this magnitude. By signing this transfer, Nathan explicitly assumes all current, immediate, and future financial liabilities, preservation duties, and structural maintenance of the property, effective the moment the ink dries. My client will no longer be responsible for any taxes, upkeep, or damages associated with the grounds. She is washing her hands of the estate entirely, and Nathan will become the sole liable party. DeAndre leaned over his lawyer's shoulder, staring at the specific paragraph Mr. Campbell had just referenced. It sounded perfectly reasonable to an uneducated, greedy mind. If you take ownership of a massive property, you naturally take ownership of the bills associated with it. DeAndre did not know that the property was an irrevocable historical trust. He just saw $10 million of collateral waiting to be tapped. He thought it was a basic transfer of responsibility to protect my corporate assets from future property tax claims. Nathan tapped his fingers impatiently on the table. So what, he asked, rolling his eyes. It means I pay the lawn care guys and the property taxes. Big deal. I am going to leverage the property for a massive commercial loan by tomorrow afternoon anyway. The bank will cover the maintenance costs once the development starts. Hand me the pen. His lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second, holding his hand up. Let me review the full wording of this preservation duty clause, Nathan. It is a bit robust for a standard residential transfer. But Nathan was not listening. He was practically salivating at the thought of the millions he was about to secure. He snatched the heavy gold pen from the center of the table and pulled the documents away from his attorney. He was so desperate to finalize the deal before I could supposedly change my mind that he completely ignored his own legal counsel. I sat silently watching him, staring at the paper, waiting for the exact moment he would legally seal his own spectacular destruction. Wait, Nathan, his lawyer said sharply, reaching across the table to grab his client's wrist. Do not sign that yet. I need to review the specific legal definition of preservation duties as it applies to this zoning district. Sometimes historical properties have hidden covenants. Nathan glared at his lawyer, clearly annoyed by the delay. We do not have time for you to bill me for another hour of reading, he snapped. The private lender is expecting the deed confirmation by 3:00 today. If I miss that window, the loan falls through. DeAndre stepped in, playing the role of the seasoned financial expert. Let me see it, he said, pulling the thick document away. DeAndre quickly skimmed the page, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. His vision was completely compromised by his own desperate greed. He did not see a lethal trap. He only saw a lifeline that could save him from the federal government. He saw an asset that could be quickly leveraged to cover the massive deficits in his fraudulent crypto accounts. It is completely standard, DeAndre announced, confidently tapping the paper with his index finger. It is basic boilerplate language for a high-value asset transfer. It just means you are legally responsible for keeping the lights on and mowing the lawn until the commercial developers break ground. It is exactly what we expected, Nathan. The lawyer frowned, adjusting his glasses. I strongly advise against signing anything I have not fully vetted, DeAndre. You are a wealth manager, not a real estate attorney. DeAndre shot the lawyer a lethal look. And you are a divorce lawyer who is about to blow a massive settlement because you are paranoid, he shot back. Look at her, DeAndre whispered, leaning closer to Nathan. Look at Cassidy. She is shaking. She is second-guessing herself right now. If we drag this out, she might change her mind and decide to fight for the property. We have her entirely on the ropes. Take the deal right now before she finds her spine. Nathan looked across the table at me. I intentionally let my lower lip tremble and averted my eyes, staring down at my lap like a beaten dog. That was all the confirmation his massive, fragile ego needed. He ripped his arm away from his lawyer and pulled the paperwork squarely in front of him. You always were too cowardly for the big leagues, Cassidy. Nathan sneered, clicking the heavy gold pen. You built a nice tech company, but you do not know how to play the real game. You do not know what it takes to be ruthless. I kept my head down, hiding the sharp smile fighting to break across my face. I just want this to be over, I whispered softly. Oh, it is over. Nathan laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. It is finally over and I am walking away with the prize. Consider this an expensive lesson in learning your proper place. You thought you could lock me out of my home and ruin my life. But the house always wins, Cassidy. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment sounded like a symphony in my ears. He signed his name with a dramatic flourish, sealing his own absolute destruction. He legally strapped a multi-million-dollar federal anchor around his own neck. He flipped to the second page and signed again. Each signature legally bound him tighter to the irrevocable historical trust he thought was a commercial goldmine. When he was finished, he shoved the documents back across the table toward Mr. Campbell. His chest was puffed out, his chin raised in pure, arrogant triumph. DeAndre patted Nathan on the shoulder, a massive grin of relief spreading across his face. They thought they had just pulled off the financial heist of the century. Mr. Campbell calmly collected the papers, verifying the signatures before stamping them with his official notary seal. He separated the copies, sliding a pristine folder across the table to me. I reached out and took my copy of the executed agreement. I stood up slowly, brushing an invisible piece of lint off my cashmere sweater. I did not look exhausted anymore. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I looked Nathan directly in the eyes and offered him a small, chilling smile. "Enjoy the estate, Nathan," I said, my voice perfectly clear and steady. "Make sure you take very good care of it." I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room without another word. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, leaving them to their foolish celebration. I stepped into the elevator. The trap was officially set and the countdown began. By the time my elevator reached the lobby, Nathan was already calling Brittany to brag. I walked out of the law firm and climbed into the back of my waiting town car, opening my laptop before the driver even pulled away from the curb. I had full access to the security matrix at my grandfather's estate. It was a massive property featuring sprawling manicured gardens, stone pathways, and historic architecture that dated back to the 19th century. Because of its immense value and remote location, I had personally installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system last year. Hidden Motion activated 4K resolution cameras covered every single inch of the exterior grounds. I pulled up the live feed and waited. It took them less than 2 hours to arrive. A bright red sports car pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates and parked directly on the pristine front lawn, tearing up the grass. Nathan stepped out looking like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. Brittany hopped out of the passenger side holding a bottle of cheap champagne. She had apparently recovered from her internet cancellation fast enough to celebrate becoming the lady of the manor. Through the high-definition cameras, I watched them walk around the exterior of the massive stone house. Nathan was gesturing wildly, pointing at the roof and the windows, probably bragging about how much money he was going to make when he bulldozed the property for commercial development. He had no idea federal historical preservation laws strictly prohibited altering even a single brick of the main structure. They eventually made their way to the central courtyard. This was the crown jewel of my grandfather's estate. In the center of the courtyard sat a stunning 150-year-old marble fountain. It was a masterpiece of Italian craftsmanship, featuring intricate carvings of climbing vines and water nymphs. My grandfather used to sit on the stone bench next to it for hours, reading his books, while the water trickled peacefully. Brittany walked up to the fountain and kicked the ancient marble with her designer boot. I turned up the audio feed on my laptop. Her shrill voice echoed perfectly across the quiet courtyard. "It is so old and ugly, Nathan," she complained, gesturing vaguely at the historic masterpiece. "We should put a massive hot tub right here. We can throw huge parties and invite all the influencers who dropped me. I will show them who actually won." Nathan laughed, taking a swig straight from the champagne bottle. "You can do whatever you want, babe," he slurred slightly. "This whole place is mine now. If you want a hot tub, we will build a hot tub." Brittany squealed with delight. She looked around the courtyard, her eyes landing on a heavy steel sledgehammer leaning against the stone wall of the gardening shed. The groundskeeper had been repairing a section of the perimeter fence earlier that week and left his tools out. Brittany marched over to the shed and picked up the heavy hammer. She dragged it across the stone pavers, struggling slightly with the weight. "What are you doing?" Nathan asked, laughing, as she hauled the sledgehammer back to the center of the courtyard. "I am doing some early demolition," Brittany declared, her eyes gleaming with chaotic entitlement. "Out with the old, and in with the new." I sat perfectly still in the back of my town car, watching my screen in absolute disbelief. Even with all my calculations, I could never have predicted a gift this perfect. Brittany hoisted the heavy steel sledgehammer over her shoulder. She took a clumsy swing and slammed the metal head directly into the side of the 150-year-old marble fountain. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the audio feed. A massive chunk of carved Italian marble broke off and shattered into a dozen pieces on the ground. Nathan cheered, clapping his hands like a proud parent watching a toddler destroy a sandcastle. Brittany giggled and swung again. This time she hit the central basin. The ancient stone gave way under the brutal impact, cracking down the middle. She struck it a third time, a fourth time, completely obliterating the historic carving until it was nothing but a pile of jagged rubble and dust. She dropped the sledgehammer, panting heavily, and threw her arms around Nathan. They kissed, standing right in the middle of a federal crime scene. I pressed the save button on my security dashboard, archiving the entire high-definition video file to my secure cloud server. The preservation duty clause Nathan had just signed held him strictly liable for any structural damage to the property. But destroying an irrevocable historic trust was not just a breach of contract. It was a direct violation of federal heritage protection laws. Brittany had just committed felony destruction of a historic landmark. As the newly signed liable party, Nathan was legally on the hook for a federal fine that would easily exceed $1 million. I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the passing city streets. They wanted to celebrate their victory by destroying my family legacy. Instead, they had just provided the exact video evidence the judge would need to bury them alive. I left the video of Brittany destroying my family legacy playing on a loop on my encrypted cloud server and told my driver to take me directly to my corporate headquarters. While Nathan and his mistress were popping cheap champagne in the ruins of a historic courtyard, I was preparing to sever his final financial artery. I walked into the main glass conference room, where my entire board of directors and my lead investor were already waiting. I had called an emergency board meeting from the back of the town car, and given the strict ethical clauses in our term sheets, attendance was mandatory. The board members looked nervous. They had weathered the storm of the viral social media smear campaign the day before, but they were still on edge about the impending divorce settlement. My lead investor, a man who despised financial instability, leaned forward, folding his hands on the long glass table. He asked me directly if Nathan was still demanding 50% of the company equity and if this legal battle was going to delay our upcoming public offering. I stood at the head of the table, plugged my laptop into the main presentation screen, and offered him a reassuring smile. I told him the legal battle was already over and Nathan was getting absolutely nothing. I opened my presentation and pulled up a scanned copy of an old corporate operating agreement amendment. I asked the board to travel back in time with me exactly 3 years. At that time, Nathan had just been promoted to junior partner at his boutique firm. To celebrate a promotion he barely earned, he went out and leased a massive luxury sports car that was wildly outside his financial reality. Within 6 months, he had defaulted on the payments. The dealership was threatening to repossess the vehicle at his office, which would have publicly humiliated him in front of DeAndre and his Wall Street colleagues. He came to me begging for a massive cash bailout. I agreed to pay off the exorbitant loan, but I demanded he sign a corporate restructuring document in return. Nathan was so desperate to keep his shiny new toy and so incredibly arrogant that he signed the thick stack of papers without reading a single paragraph. He assumed it was just standard tax restructuring. He did not realize I had my legal team bury a highly specific aggressive poison pill clause deep inside the operating agreement. I highlighted the clause on the presentation screen for the board to read. It explicitly stated that any non-founding spouse who becomes the subject of a federal financial fraud investigation or who commits a felony-level crime against the primary shareholders, assets automatically and irrevocably forfeits any and all claims to the company equity voting rights and future dividends. My lead investor adjusted his glasses reading the highlighted text. It is an ironclad clause, he noted, but it requires a triggering event. A divorce does not activate a poison pill, Cassidy. We need documented proof of federal financial crimes to enforce this and sever his equity ties legally. I nodded, pressing the next button on my presentation remote. I brought up the encrypted dossier I had compiled on DeAndre and Nathan. I walked the board through the active Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into their firm. I showed them the fraudulent crypto margin calls, the illegally commingled client funds, and the impending federal audit that Nathan was desperately trying to cover up with my grandfather's estate. Then I pressed the button one more time. The screen switched to the high-definition security footage I had captured less than an hour ago. The boardroom watched in absolute stunned silence as Brittany took the heavy steel sledgehammer and completely obliterated the 150-year-old marble fountain. I explained that the property was a federally protected, irrevocable historical trust. By signing the liability transfer earlier that morning, Nathan was now legally responsible for a federal heritage destruction felony. The triggering events were not just met, they were overwhelmingly surpassed. The board needed no deliberation. The evidence of Nathan's criminal liability was irrefutable and thoroughly documented. My lead investor called for an immediate formal vote to activate the poison pill clause and expel Nathan from all corporate holdings. The vote was unanimous. The legal team immediately drafted the severing documents, filing them electronically with the state corporate registry. With a few swift keystrokes, Nathan was completely and permanently excised from my life's work. He thought he was a brilliant financial genius, orchestrating a massive payday. He had no idea he was currently celebrating his own total bankruptcy. While he drank champagne with his mistress, I was ensuring he would never see a single penny of my company profits ever again. The night before the final court hearing, the contrast between our two worlds could not have been more extreme. I sat alone in my quiet penthouse, the sprawling view of the New York City skyline spread out before me like a glittering grid of data. The air conditioning hummed softly, keeping the room at a perfect temperature. I was sitting cross-legged on my living room floor surrounded by stacks of impeccably organized legal documents. In the center of the pile sat a single bright red file folder. I methodically placed each piece of the puzzle into the red folder. First, I slid in the original irrevocable historical trust deed verifying that the $10 million estate could never be sold or mortgaged. Second, I inserted the highly classified SEC investigation report detailing DeAndre and Nathan's massive crypto fraud, along with the IP address logs my private investigator had secured, proving DeAndre's office filed the forged mortgage documents. Third, I added the digital credit monitoring alerts confirming Nathan had actively forged my signature to secure the illegal $3 million private loan. And finally, I placed a sleek silver USB drive into the front pocket of the folder. It contained the high-definition 4K video of Brittany obliterating the 150-year-old marble fountain and cementing Nathan's liability for a federal felony. The red folder was heavy in my hands. It was not just paper and plastic, it was a loaded weapon. I traced the edge of the folder, taking a deep breath of the cool, quiet air. I had spent the last 5 years of my life trying to be the perfect wife to a man who saw me as an endless ATM. I had endured the snide comments from his sister, the arrogant bullying from his brother-in-law, and the ultimate betrayal of his infidelity. But tomorrow morning I was not walking into that courtroom as a victim. I was walking in as an executioner. While I was meticulously organizing their destruction, Nathan and DeAndre were celebrating their incoming millions. My private investigator sent me a final update before signing off for the night. Nathan had rented out a private VIP room at an exclusive midtown cigar bar. He and DeAndre were drinking $200 glasses of scotch surrounded by a cloud of thick, expensive smoke. Nathan was loudly bragging to the bartender that he had just successfully bullied his tech robot wife into handing over a massive historic estate. He claimed the commercial developers had already promised him a massive cash buyout by the end of the quarter. He was telling anyone who would listen that he was officially a multi-millionaire. DeAndre was sitting next to him looking more relaxed than he had in weeks. The paralyzing terror from the SEC investigation seemed to have vanished, entirely replaced by his usual Wall Street arrogance. DeAndre genuinely believed that the $3 million illegal loan Nathan secured that morning would be enough to cover the massive deficits in his fraudulent crypto accounts. He thought the federal auditors would simply pack up and leave once the accounts showed a positive balance. They were two incredibly arrogant men, clinking their crystal glasses together, entirely oblivious to the reality that they were celebrating their last night of freedom. I stood up from the floor, leaving the red folder perfectly aligned on my glass coffee table. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and looked out at the city lights. Nathan thought this war was about money and real estate. He never understood that it was always about leverage and data. He operated on ego, assuming he was the smartest person in the room simply because he wore a custom suit and yelled the loudest. I operated on algorithms, anticipating his desperate moves and simply waiting for him to make the fatal mathematical error. I went to bed that night and slept more soundly than I had in months. There were no anxious thoughts, no worries about my company's funding, no lingering heartbreak over the end of my marriage. The emotional detachment was total and absolute. I woke up the next morning precisely at 6 o'clock before my alarm even went off. I showered, pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek knot, and put on my sharpest charcoal gray tailored suit. I did not wear any jewelry, except for the simple silver watch my grandfather had given me when I graduated from college. I picked up the red file folder from the coffee table, slid it into my leather briefcase, and walked out the door. The trap was perfectly armed, and the courtroom was waiting. The air inside the Manhattan courthouse was heavy with the sterile scent of floor wax and old wood. I walked through the metal detectors with my head held high, feeling the weight of the red file folder resting securely inside my leather briefcase. Mr. Campbell met me in the grand lobby, his expression perfectly neutral. We did not exchange any nervous chatter. We both knew exactly what was about to happen. We took the elevator to the 5th floor and pushed open the heavy double doors of courtroom 4. The room was already packed. Because my logistics firm had recently made headlines, a few financial reporters had slipped into the back benches hoping for a corporate scandal. They were about to get the story of their careers, just not the one they were expecting. I walked down the central aisle and took my seat at the petitioner table. A few moments later, the heavy doors swung open again, and Nathan made his grand entrance. He strutted into the courtroom like a celebrity walking a red carpet. He was wearing a brand-new custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His chest was puffed out with sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He did not look like a man going through a divorce. He looked like a man arriving at a victory parade. He walked past my table and offered me a condescending smirk before taking his seat next to his aggressive trial lawyer. Jasmine and DeAndre walked in right behind him. They bypassed the wooden gate and took prime seats in the public gallery directly behind Nathan. Jasmine was wearing a bright yellow designer dress completely inappropriate for a solemn legal proceeding. She leaned over the wooden rail, whispering something into her brother's ear, and then let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed across the quiet courtroom. DeAndre sat next to her, looking incredibly relaxed. He had his legs crossed and his arms resting confidently on the bench. He truly believed that the $3 million illegal mortgage Nathan had secured yesterday was going to quietly save his wealth management firm from the federal auditors. He had no idea I had the federal investigation file sitting less than 10 feet away from him. The court bailiff stepped forward and instructed everyone to rise. Judge Peterson entered the courtroom from his private chambers. He was a stern older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for having zero patience for legal theatrics. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and banged his wooden gavel once. He called the court to order, stating that we were here to finalize the division of marital assets and officially dissolve the marriage between Nathan and me. Before Judge Peterson even finished his opening remarks, Nathan's lawyer shot up from his chair. He was a loud, aggressive man who loved the sound of his own voice. He immediately launched into a highly theatrical opening statement, pacing back and forth across the carpeted floor. "Your Honor," the lawyer boomed, pointing a dramatic finger toward my table. "We are here today to rectify a gross financial injustice. My client has endured years of emotional neglect and financial abuse at the hands of a wealthy tech executive. She maliciously locked him out of his own home. She weaponized her corporate resources to humiliate him in the public eye. Therefore, we are demanding the immediate and irrevocable transfer of her grandfather's $10 million estate directly into my client's name to compensate for his extreme emotional distress." The lawyer paused, letting the massive dollar amount hang in the quiet air of the courtroom. The financial reporters in the back row immediately started typing furiously on their phones. "But that is not all, Your Honor," the lawyer continued, his voice rising in volume. "Because my client sacrificed the prime years of his career to support his wife's entrepreneurial dreams. We are also demanding an immediate court order, transferring 50% of her corporate shares and voting rights. She has already agreed to surrender the real estate during mediation. We have the signed documents right here. Now we demand the remaining corporate equity to make this a fair dissolution." Nathan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and grinning. Jasmine clapped her hands together once in the gallery, a sharp sound of greedy excitement. Judge Peterson looked down at the aggressive lawyer, then shifted his sharp gaze over to my table. He asked Mr. Campbell if we had a response to these extreme demands. I did not let my lawyer speak. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the bright red file folder. Before I could open the folder and present my response to the court, Nathan abruptly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor. He held up a hand, signaling his own lawyer to sit down. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted to be the main character in what he believed was the final scene of his great victory. "Your Honor," Nathan said, smoothing the lapels of his expensive custom suit, "I would like to address the court myself if it pleases the bench." Judge Peterson raised a thick gray eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to clients interrupting their own legal counsel during opening statements. He did not like grandstanding in his courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses and gave a slow nod, leaning back in his high leather chair. "Proceed, Nathan, but keep it strictly to the facts of the asset division." Nathan walked out from behind his table, stepping confidently into the open space of the courtroom floor. He clasped his hands in front of him, adopting a remarkably fake expression of profound sadness and exhaustion. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Your Honor, for 5 long years, I was the dutiful, supportive husband to a woman who cared more about artificial intelligence algorithms than she did about our marriage. When Cassidy started her supply chain tech company, it was my financial stability and my emotional labor that kept our household running. I sacrificed the prime years of my Wall Street career to stand by her side. I worked grueling hours to make sure she had the freedom to build her corporate empire. I sat perfectly still, listening to his outrageous lies. I did not glare at him or shake my head in denial. I simply watched him with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a lab rat running eagerly into a lethal trap. My lawyer, Mr. Campbell, shifted slightly in his seat, but I placed a steadying hand on his wrist, indicating that he should let Nathan continue digging his own grave. "And how did my wife repay my years of unwavering devotion?" Nathan asked, his voice echoing dramatically across the quiet courtroom. "She rewarded me with deceit. While I was struggling to keep my boutique investment firm afloat, paying our bills, and supporting her dreams, she was maliciously hiding a massive asset from me. She deliberately concealed a $10 million historic estate left to her by her grandfather. She kept this incredible fortune a complete secret, hoarding the wealth while allowing me to bear the brunt of our financial burdens." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The financial reporters in the back row leaned forward, practically salivating over the scandalous narrative. Jasmine nodded vigorously from her seat in the front row, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She was playing her part beautifully. DeAndre sat next to her, radiating smug satisfaction. He looked at me with a triumphant sneer, fully believing that the document Nathan was about to present would make them all incredibly rich. Nathan paced slowly in front of the judge's bench, shaking his head as if he were a deeply wounded martyr. When I finally discovered the truth about the estate, she reacted with psychotic rage. She locked me out of our shared penthouse, freezing me in the dead of winter. She launched a coordinated digital smear campaign to ruin my professional reputation. She tried to destroy me. Your Honor, simply because I asked for my rightful legal share of the marital assets. Judge Peterson frowned, his pen hovering over his legal pad. These are serious allegations, Nathan. But the court operates on documented evidence, not emotional grievances. Do you have proof regarding the division of this $10 million property? Nathan smiled, a wide, predatory grin that completely broke his facade of the wounded husband. I absolutely do, Your Honor. He walked swiftly back to his table and picked up the thick stack of papers we had signed during the mediation session the previous morning. He practically strutted over to the bailiff, handing the documents over with a grand flourish. The bailiff passed the stack up to the judge's bench. That is a legally binding mediation agreement, Nathan stated proudly, his voice booming with arrogant confidence, signed and notarized yesterday morning. Recognizing her own gross misconduct and the sheer weight of her financial abuse, my wife voluntarily yielded all rights, title, and interest in her grandfather's estate to me. She legally surrendered the property to settle the dispute. That $10 million asset is now rightfully mine, but that is only the beginning. Because of her malicious actions, I am also asking this court to enforce an immediate transfer of 50% of her company shares. Judge Peterson picked up the mediation documents, flipping slowly through the first few pages. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Nathan could not contain himself. The absolute thrill of his perceived victory was intoxicating him. The adrenaline of the con, the rush of finally crushing me, it was all bubbling to the surface. He slowly turned his back to the judge and faced my table. He looked down at me, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of greed and pure, unadulterated arrogance. He wanted to break me right there in front of the reporters, the lawyers, and his greedy family. In the dead silence of the packed courtroom, Nathan threw his head back and literally laughed out loud. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the high wood-paneled ceiling. He pointed a finger directly at my face, his smugness radiating through the room. I am taking half your fortune, he stated, his voice dripping with venom, including your grandfather's estate. The echo of his cruel laughter bounced off the polished mahogany walls and slowly died in the cavernous space of the courtroom. Complete, heavy silence fell over the massive room, trapping his words entirely. The financial reporters in the back row stopped typing immediately. Jasmine lowered her clapping hands, her triumphant smile freezing in place. DeAndre shifted slightly in his wooden seat, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read my expression. They were all waiting for me to break. They expected tears, a frantic objection, or a desperate plea to the judge. I did not flinch. I did not break my intense eye contact with Nathan for a second. I let the heavy silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing the sheer arrogance of his statement to hang in the air. Then I calmly placed my hands flat on the petitioner table and pushed my chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the floor was the only sound in the room. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray suit. I reached down into my leather briefcase, resting on the floor, and pulled out the thick, bright red file folder. I did not look at Mr. Campbell, who remained perfectly still beside me. He knew his exact role was to sit quietly and let the written evidence completely speak for itself. Holding the red folder securely in my right hand, I walked out from behind my table. I moved with incredibly slow, deliberate precision. Every eye in the courtroom followed my path. I walked right past Nathan, who was still standing proudly in the center of the floor. His smug grin faltered slightly as I approached. He clearly expected me to shout at him or perhaps beg him to reconsider in front of the gallery. Instead, I treated him like an invisible obstacle, completely ignoring his presence. I approached the high wooden bench where Judge Peterson sat, looking down at me with a mixture of judicial curiosity and strict impatience. I stopped right in front of the bench. I held out the bright red folder toward the bailiff, who stepped forward to take it from my hands. He passed it up to the judge, placing it directly on top of the ridiculous mediation agreement Nathan had just submitted moments prior. I looked Judge Peterson directly in the eyes. My voice was calm, carrying easily to the back row without needing to shout. I believe my husband has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the assets he is attempting to claim, I said clearly. I suggest you check the legal status of that real estate again very carefully, Your Honor. I turned around and walked back to my seat, moving with the same steady rhythm. I sat down next to Mr. Campbell, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. Up on the high bench, Judge Peterson opened the red folder. The heavy cover flipped back, revealing the original irrevocable historical trust deed resting right on top of the pile. The courtroom remained entirely breathless. Even the aggressive trial lawyer representing Nathan had stopped shuffling his legal pads, staring nervously up at the judge. We watched Judge Peterson scan the very first page. His eyes tracked left to right, reading the dense legal language my grandfather had intentionally put in place decades ago. He flipped to the second page. This page contained the federal tax classifications and the strict municipal zoning restrictions permanently binding the property to the state. Judge Peterson stopped reading for a moment. He reached up and slowly adjusted his reading glasses, pulling them slightly down his nose, as if he could not quite believe the words printed clearly on the official paper. He read the paragraph again, his lips moving slightly as he processed the information. Then he picked up the signed mediation agreement Nathan had so proudly submitted a few minutes earlier, comparing the two legally binding documents side by side. He was specifically looking at the absolute liability clause Nathan had eagerly signed yesterday. The stern, uncompromising judge, who was famous throughout the entire state for holding veteran lawyers in strict contempt for even the slightest minor breach of courtroom decorum, let out a sound that absolutely nobody expected to hear. A sharp snort suddenly escaped his nose, echoing in the silent room. He quickly covered his mouth with his hand, trying desperately to suppress it, but the absolute realization of what Nathan had just legally done to himself was simply too much to contain. Judge Peterson looked down from the high bench, staring directly at Nathan, who was still standing awkwardly in the middle of the floor, looking utterly confused. The judge dropped his hand, threw his head back, and burst into loud, uncontrollable laughter. The sound of Judge Peterson laughing was completely surreal. It echoed through the heavy wooden chamber, breaking the strict decorum he was so famous for upholding. In the gallery, Jasmine stopped pretending to cry and sat up perfectly straight, her mouth slightly open in sheer confusion. DeAndre gripped the wooden rail in front of him, his knuckles turning white. The smug satisfaction completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden creeping panic. He knew enough about the legal system to understand that a judge laughing at a plaintiff during an asset division hearing was a catastrophic sign. Nathan stood frozen in the center of the courtroom floor. His arrogant posture deflated, and a dark flush of embarrassment crept up his neck. He looked at his aggressive trial lawyer, who was furiously flipping through his own copies of the mediation agreement, trying to find whatever had triggered the judge's outburst. But his lawyer did not have the red folder. Judge Peterson finally caught his breath. He reached under his black robe, pulled out a white cotton handkerchief, and actually wiped a tear of mirth from his right eye. He cleared his throat, composing himself back into the stern figure of judicial authority, but a sharp, amused glint remained in his eyes. "Mr. Nathan," he began, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I have presided over family court for 22 years. I have seen spouses fight over bank accounts, businesses, and vacation homes. But I have never in my entire career seen a man strut into my courtroom so incredibly proud of successfully swindling himself. Nathan blinked, stepping forward. Swindling myself. Your Honor, I do not understand. I have a signed mediation agreement yielding a $10 million commercial estate directly to me. Judge Peterson shook his head, resting his hands on the high bench. That is exactly your problem, Nathan. You saw a massive dollar amount, and you let your greed completely blind you to the actual legal definitions printed on the paper you signed. The judge picked up the original deed from my red folder and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. This property is not a commercial estate. It is not a residential development opportunity. And it certainly is not a marital asset that can be divided or liquidated. According to this federal charter established by Cassidy's grandfather, this estate is an irrevocable historical trust registered directly with the federal government. Nathan stared at the judge, his face completely blank as his brain struggled to process the legal terminology. But it is valued at $10 million, Nathan argued, his voice sounding remarkably small and desperate. It is insured for $10 million strictly for historical preservation purposes, Judge Peterson corrected him sharply. But its commercial resale value on the open real estate market is exactly $0. Cassidy never owned this property. She was legally designated as the uncompensated trustee. Her only relationship to this estate was a legal obligation to oversee its maintenance. She could not sell it. She could not mortgage it. She could not leverage it for capital. And neither can you. The aggressive trial lawyer standing next to Nathan finally understood the trap. He dropped his legal pad onto the table, the heavy thud echoing loudly. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, looking violently ill. Are you saying my client just assumed the trustee position of a federally protected landmark? I am saying your client just aggressively demanded and legally bound himself to a piece of property that is completely useless to him, Judge Peterson replied. He cannot bulldoze it for a shopping mall. He cannot build condos on it. If he tries to sell it, the federal government will instantly block the transaction. He just fought tooth and nail to take ownership of a massive financial ghost. In the gallery, DeAndre let out a sharp, audible gasp. The sound cut through the room like a knife. The realization hit the wealth manager like a speeding freight train. DeAndre had just allowed his brother-in-law to secure a $3 million illegal underground loan, using a property that could not legally be used as collateral. The violent private lenders were going to realize the deed was utterly worthless. DeAndre clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as his own massive federal crimes began to close in around him. Nathan shook his head, taking a step back. No, that is impossible, he stammered, turning to look at me with wild, panicked eyes. She lied. She told me it was a massive asset. She told me I could have it. She told you she would yield her rights to it. Judge Peterson corrected him, slamming his hand flat on the bench. And she did exactly that. You signed a legally binding document aggressively demanding to take over the property. You took the bait without reading the fine print. You own nothing but the legal title of a historical caretaker. The financial reporters in the back were writing furiously, their eyes wide with shock. Nathan looked down at his trembling hands, his custom suit suddenly looking like a clown costume. He had wanted to leave me with nothing, but instead, he had successfully fought for the right to own absolutely nothing himself. He was completely trapped. But owning a worthless title was only the beginning of the nightmare I had carefully constructed for him. Judge Peterson was not finished reading. He closed the thick historical trust deed and picked up the mediation agreement that Nathan had so arrogantly shoved across the mahogany table just 24 hours earlier. The judge smoothed the paper flat and adjusted his glasses, his amusement slowly fading into a sharp, judicial glare. Your problem, Nathan, is not just that this estate has zero commercial value, Judge Peterson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Your problem is the specific liability clause you enthusiastically signed to expedite this transfer. You demanded immediate legal responsibility for this landmark. You explicitly assumed all current, immediate, and future financial liabilities, preservation duties, and structural maintenance. Do you have any idea what that actually entails for a federally registered historic site? Nathan swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. I assume it means basic upkeep, he muttered. Landscaping, property taxes. Judge Peterson let out a short, humorless bark of a laugh. Basic upkeep. Nathan, this is a 19th century federal heritage site. Under state law, the designated caretaker is legally mandated to employ specialized historical contractors for all maintenance. The property taxes and mandatory preservation upkeep for an estate of this magnitude currently run exactly $50,000 a month. That is $600,000 a year, that you are now legally bound by federal contract to pay out of your own pocket. If you default, the government will seize your personal assets to cover the debt. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The financial reporters were practically vibrating with excitement, typing quotes as fast as their fingers could move. They knew they were witnessing the absolute dismantling of a Wall Street career in real time. Jasmine clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She looked at DeAndre, but her husband was staring blankly at the floor, paralyzed by his own impending doom. Nathan gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles completely white. $50,000 a month, he repeated, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of the number. But I do not have that kind of liquid capital. My firm is struggling. I decided it was time to drop the final anvil. I stood up smoothly from my chair, buttoning my charcoal gray suit jacket. Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. My husband is currently expressing concern about the financial burden of his new preservation duties. Unfortunately, I must inform the court that he has already egregiously violated those exact duties. I have one final piece of evidence to submit regarding the immediate structural integrity of the historic estate. Judge Peterson raised an eyebrow, turning his sharp gaze toward me. Proceed, Cassidy. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the sleek silver USB drive. I handed it to the bailiff, who walked it over to the court technician sitting beside the jury box. I respectfully request the court review the security footage captured yesterday afternoon at my grandfather's estate, I said. The footage was recorded precisely 3 hours after Nathan signed the liability transfer. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the technician plugged the drive into the system. The large monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life, displaying brilliant high-definition 4K resolution video. The screen showed the serene historic courtyard and the beautiful 150-year-old Italian marble fountain. Then the bright red sports car pulled into the frame. The entire courtroom watched in absolute stunned silence as Brittany hopped out, grabbed the heavy steel sledgehammer from the gardening shed, and dragged it to the center of the courtyard. The audio feed was crystal clear. Every person in the room heard Brittany complain about the ugly ancient fountain and declare her plans to build a hot tub. They heard Nathan laughing and drunkenly giving her permission to destroy his new property. Then they watched the heavy steel hammer swing. Nathan's aggressive trial lawyer literally buried his face in his hands, refusing to even look at the monitor. The sickening crack of the ancient marble shattering echoed through the quiet courtroom. Brittany swung again and again, completely obliterating the priceless historical artifact into a pile of jagged, useless rubble, while Nathan cheered and clapped in the background. When the video ended, the monitor faded to black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and incredibly heavy. Judge Peterson looked like a storm about to break. His face was flushed with genuine anger. He looked down at Nathan with pure, unadulterated disgust. You signed a binding legal document assuming full responsibility for a federal landmark, and 3 hours later, you supervised its malicious destruction. Judge Peterson thundered, his voice shaking the walls. That fountain was a protected historical artifact. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, the penalty for deliberate felony destruction of a heritage site is a mandatory fine. Because you are the legally liable party, Nathan, you are hereby ordered to pay an immediate federal fine of $1.2 million. Nathan was hyperventilating. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of pale gray. He grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table, swaying slightly on his feet, as if the solid floor beneath him had suddenly turned to liquid. $1.2 million, he gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Your Honor, you cannot do this to me. I do not have that kind of money. I do not have any money at all. His aggressive trial lawyer immediately jumped up, waving his hands in a frantic attempt to backpedal and distance himself from the radioactive disaster standing next to him. Your Honor, my client was completely unaware of the federal statutes regarding historical trusts. The lawyer stammered desperately, trying to salvage his own professional reputation. We request an immediate stay on that federal fine. Furthermore, we formally request that this specific financial penalty be considered a shared marital liability since the property transfer was finalized during the dissolution process. Judge Peterson slammed his wooden gavel down so hard the sharp crack made Jasmine physically jump in the gallery. Absolutely not. The judge barked, his eyes blazing with judicial fury. Your client signed a legally binding document explicitly assuming all financial liabilities. He took the property. He destroyed the property. That fine belongs entirely to him, and the federal government will collect it. I remained standing, my posture perfectly straight and composed. I looked at Nathan, watching his arrogant facade crumble into absolute pathetic terror. But I was not finished. The anvil had dropped, but the floor had not yet opened up to swallow him whole. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the crowded courtroom. If my husband is concerned about his sudden lack of liquid capital to pay his federal fines, I believe I can shed some light on his current financial situation. I have one final document to submit for the court's consideration today. Nathan whipped his head around to look at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. What are you doing? He hissed, his voice cracking. Cassidy, stop! Just stop talking! I ignored his pathetic pleading. I reached into my red file folder and pulled out the crisp printed logs from my premium credit monitoring service, along with the sworn affidavit from my private investigator. I handed the documents to the bailiff, who swiftly carried them up to the judge's high bench. Yesterday afternoon, while my husband was celebrating his supposed acquisition of the historic estate, he realized he needed immediate cash, I explained smoothly. So he visited an underground private lender in the garment district. He secured a $3 million short-term loan using the historic estate as his primary collateral. The trial lawyer stared at Nathan, his jaw literally dropping open in shock. You took out a $3 million underground loan without telling me. The lawyer whispered furiously, his face turning purple. Are you completely insane? I cannot represent you if you are committing financial crimes behind my back. But, Your Honor. I continued, raising my voice, just enough to command the room. There is a significant legal complication regarding that specific loan. The private lender required both spouses to sign the collateral agreement because the estate was technically still listed under our joint financial umbrella at the time. I was not present at that meeting. I did not review those documents, and I certainly did not sign them. Judge Peterson leaned forward, picking up the printed logs. He adjusted his glasses, his expression darkening with every sentence he read. Are you explicitly alleging that your husband forged your signature on a multi-million-dollar financial document, Cassidy? I am not just alleging it, Your Honor, I replied calmly. The documents you are currently holding contain the digital timestamp of the credit inquiry triggered by the private lender. Attached is the audio transcript captured by a licensed private investigator legally observing the transaction. My husband actively forged my signature on the federal loan document to secure the $3 million wire transfer. Nathan let out a strangled cry, backing away from his table. No, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. She is lying. She set me up. She told me I could have the estate. Judge Peterson held up a hand, silencing Nathan instantly. The judge carefully reviewed the time-stamped credit logs and the private investigator's sworn affidavit. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents above us. DeAndre was clutching his chest in the gallery, his breathing ragged and shallow as the reality of the forgery set in. This court is finalizing the division of marital assets, Judge Peterson announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Because this $3 million loan was acquired through the illegal forgery of a spouse's signature, it cannot and will not be classified as a shared marital burden. I am officially ruling that the $3 million private loan is the sole separate debt of the petitioner Nathan. He alone is responsible for its repayment. Nathan collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He was now $4.2 million in debt. But Judge Peterson was not done. The judge slowly took off his reading glasses and looked directly at the court bailiff standing by the main exit. Bailiff Judge Peterson commanded, his tone instantly shifting from a family court judge to a strict officer of the law. Lock the courtroom doors. Nobody leaves this room. Based on the documented evidence presented today, a felony financial crime has been committed within this jurisdiction. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot, shattering the remaining illusion of safety in the courtroom. DeAndre shot up from his seat in the public gallery. His eyes darted wildly toward the locked double doors, and then back to the bailiff standing firmly in front of them. The sophisticated Wall Street persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man who knew the federal government was closing in. He grabbed his leather briefcase and tried to casually shuffle down the wooden pew toward the side aisle. He kept his head down, hoping the sheer chaos surrounding Nathan would cover his quiet escape. "Where do you think you are going?" DeAndre, Jasmine hissed, grabbing his jacket sleeve. He violently ripped his arm away. "I have to leave," he whispered frantically. "I need to call my lawyers right now. Let me go." He lunged into the aisle, but the bailiff immediately unclipped his radio and pointed a stern finger directly at DeAndre's chest. "Return to your seat, sir," the bailiff ordered. The judge gave a direct order. "Nobody leaves this courtroom until the proceedings are formally concluded." DeAndre froze, his hands trembling as he clutched his briefcase. He slowly collapsed onto the wooden bench. Judge Peterson watched the pathetic display before turning his attention back to my table. I remained standing perfectly calm amidst the destruction I had just orchestrated. I reached into my red file folder and pulled out the final piece of paper. The trap had caught Nathan, but DeAndre was the bigger fish. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice level, "I believe the gentleman attempting to flee the gallery is intimately connected to the felony forgery. I have one final addendum to submit regarding the $3 million private loan." DeAndre let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Nathan whipped his head around, staring at his brother-in-law with terrified eyes. Judge Peterson gestured for the bailiff to approach. "What exactly does this addendum prove, Cassidy?" the judge asked. The bailiff took the single sheet of paper from my hand and passed it up to the bench. "It proves that my husband did not orchestrate this massive federal wire fraud entirely on his own," I explained clearly. "Nathan lacks the financial network required to secure $3 million in untraceable funds in under 24 hours. He had an accomplice. The document you are holding contains the certified digital routing data provided by my private investigator. It tracks the exact IP address used to officially file and transmit the forged loan documents to the underground lender." Judge Peterson adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the technical routing data. His eyes narrowed as he read the final highlighted line. "That IP address does not belong to a public coffee shop or a residential internet network," I stated loudly, ensuring the financial reporters in the back row caught every single word. "That IP address is officially registered to the private wealth management firm owned and operated by DeAndre. He used his corporate servers to facilitate the transmission of a forged federal loan document." DeAndre buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic moan. Judge Peterson dropped the paper onto his desk, his expression hardening into absolute judicial fury. He looked directly past Nathan and locked his eyes onto DeAndre, cowering in the gallery. "Sir, stand up," Judge Peterson commanded. DeAndre slowly stood, his legs shaking so badly he had to lean against the wooden rail for support. "You are an actively licensed wealth manager in the state of New York," the judge stated, his voice dripping with disgust. And according to this certified digital evidence, you utilized your professional corporate infrastructure to aid and abet a multi-million-dollar felony wire fraud. I did not know the signature was forged, DeAndre stammered weakly, tears streaming down his face. Nathan told me she signed it. I was just helping family. Save your pathetic excuses for the federal prosecutors. Judge Peterson snapped, interrupting him immediately. This court does not have the jurisdiction to formally indict you today, but I assure you the consequences will be swift. I am officially forwarding this entire evidentiary file directly to the district attorney for immediate criminal review. Furthermore, I am sending a formal complaint to the New York State Bar. Your professional licenses will be suspended by the end of the business day. Jasmine leaped up from the bench, her bright yellow designer dress flashing in the sterile courtroom light. She turned on DeAndre, her face twisted with absolute rage. "You idiot!" she screamed, slapping his shoulder. "You promised me this was foolproof. You are going to federal prison and you are taking all our money with you. My house, my cars, my entire lifestyle, you ruined everything." Jasmine kept screaming at DeAndre, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that pierced the heavy air of the locked courtroom. She hit him again and again, completely abandoning any pretense of the wealthy, sophisticated socialite she pretended to be. DeAndre did not even try to defend himself against her furious assault. He just sat there absorbing her physical blows, staring blankly at the floor as his entire world collapsed into ruins. Judge Peterson banged his wooden gavel, repeatedly demanding order, but the absolute chaos had already consumed the public gallery. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knock echoed from the back of the courtroom. The bailiff, who was still standing guard by the locked double doors, immediately glanced up at the judge. Judge Peterson gave a single sharp nod of authorization. The bailiff turned the heavy metal deadbolt and pulled one of the massive wooden doors open. Two tall men wearing dark gray suits and stern, unyielding expressions stepped into the courtroom. They bypassed the wooden gate separating the gallery from the floor and walked directly into the center of the room. The taller of the two men reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming silver shield. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The lead agent announced, his deep voice cutting through Jasmine's hysterical screaming and instantly silencing the entire room. "We are looking for Nathan and DeAndre." I remained perfectly still at the petitioner table. I had sent my private investigator's encrypted file to the federal authorities 3 days ago, anonymously tipping them off to the massive crypto fraud and the impending forged loan. I knew they were aggressively building a case, but seeing them walk into the courtroom validated every single calculated risk I had taken during this entire ordeal. Nathan froze, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief as the two federal agents approached his table. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive speeding truck. His aggressive trial lawyer immediately took 3 massive steps backward, physically distancing himself from his client. The lawyer wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal indictment. "Nathan," the lead agent said, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt, "you are officially under arrest for felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and the deliberate destruction of a federally protected historical landmark. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No," Nathan whimpered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "No, this is a massive mistake. I am a victim here. My wife is a millionaire tech CEO. She gave me the property. You have the wrong person." The second agent stepped forward, ignoring his pathetic protests. He grabbed Nathan's right arm and twisted it firmly behind his back. Nathan let out a sharp cry of physical pain. The cold steel of the handcuff clicked loudly, securely locking around his wrist. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom, a definitive mechanical end to his arrogant reign. The agent pulled his left arm back and secured the second cuff. As the reality of this cold steel bit into his skin, Nathan's legs completely gave out. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor of the courtroom. The expensive custom navy suit he had worn like a victory banner was now crumpled and dirty. He looked up at me, his face entirely devoid of the smug entitlement that had defined our entire marriage. He was crying, sobbing uncontrollably like a terrified child who had just broken a window and knew the punishment was going to be severe. "Cassidy," he begged, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his absolute terror. "Please, please tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you will pay the federal fine. You have the money. You can hire the best lawyers in the city to fix this. Please do not let them take me away to prison. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the divorce. I will walk away with absolutely nothing. Just please save me." I looked down at the man I had once loved unconditionally. The man I had supported, funded, and trusted for 5 years. He had tried to steal my grandfather's legacy, ruin my corporate empire, and humiliate me in front of the entire world. And now he was kneeling in the dirt, begging for my financial protection. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no lingering affection. The emotional detachment was perfectly complete. I picked up my briefcase from the table and snapped the brass locks shut. I looked down at Nathan kneeling on the floor, his tears staining his expensive silk tie. "I am just a tech robot, Nathan," I said, my voice completely flat and colder than the New York winter outside. "I do not know how to save you." The federal agents hauled Nathan to his feet. He was dead weight, sobbing hysterically as they dragged him toward the heavy wooden doors. The bailiff unlocked the deadbolt, stepping aside to let the authorities remove the prisoner. The sound of Nathan weeping echoed down the marble hallway outside long after the doors swung shut behind him. His aggressive trial lawyer was already packing his briefcase, moving with frantic speed to escape the courtroom before anyone could associate him further with the catastrophe. The lawyer practically ran out the side exit, abandoning his client entirely. Inside the gallery, the silence left in Nathan's wake was instantly shattered by the shrill ringing of a cell phone. Jasmine jumped frantically, digging into her designer handbag. She pulled out her phone, staring at the screen with wide, panicked eyes. It was a high-priority alert from her private banking concierge. She answered the call, pressing the phone hard against her ear. I stood at my table and watched her face transform from horrified shock to absolute disbelief. The blood drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a hollow, fragile shell. She dropped the phone onto the solid wooden pew with a loud clatter. "What did you do, DeAndre?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the excited murmurs of the reporters furiously typing in the back row. DeAndre did not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the polished floor, his shoulders slumped in total, absolute defeat. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to the electric chair. "You emptied our accounts!" Jasmine screamed suddenly, lunging forward and grabbing the lapels of his ruined custom suit. "The concierge just told me our joint accounts are entirely gone. Our savings, our investment portfolios, the offshore trusts for the children. Everything is completely empty. Where is my money, DeAndre?" DeAndre finally looked up, his eyes red and wet. He looked incredibly pathetic, stripped of all his Wall Street arrogance. "I had to pay the initial SEC penalties," he mumbled, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "I thought if I quietly paid the first wave of fines, the federal auditors would drop the investigation before the trial even started. I thought I could cover it up and make it all go away. I needed the liquid cash, Jasmine. I had no other choice to keep us out of prison." "You stole from me," Jasmine shrieked, slapping him across the face so hard the sharp crack echoed through the massive courtroom. "You stole my children's trust funds. You stole my entire life." Judge Peterson banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order and threatening to hold her in contempt, but Jasmine was completely beyond reason. The wealthy, untouchable facade she had weaponized against me for 5 long years was entirely obliterated. She was suddenly just a broke, desperate woman tethered to a disgraced felon. She hit him again, her perfectly manicured nails scratching his cheek. Before the bailiff could forcefully remove Jasmine from the gallery, the heavy courtroom doors burst open again. An elderly woman stumbled into the room, breathing heavily and clutching a thick stack of manila envelopes to her chest. It was Martha. Nathan's mother looked completely disheveled, her gray hair wildly out of place, and her modest suburban clothes deeply wrinkled. She had clearly rushed here in an absolute blind panic. She did not even notice DeAndre sobbing or her daughter Jasmine screaming like a banshee. She frantically scanned the room looking for her golden child. "Where is Nathan?" Martha cried out, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered terror. "Where is my son? I need him right now." I stepped away from the petitioner table, buttoning my charcoal gray suit jacket. "Nathan is currently in federal custody." "Martha," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "He was just arrested for wire fraud and felony property destruction. He will not be able to help you today or any day in the foreseeable future." Martha stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, before she collapsed heavily against the wooden rail of the gallery. She dropped the manila envelopes onto the floor. They spilled open, revealing bright red foreclosure notices and aggressive collection agency letters. "The bank just took my house," she sobbed, covering her face with her trembling hands. "The sheriff deputies showed up this morning and changed the locks. They told me I have a massive mountain of defaulted debt. They said I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to luxury credit card companies. I do not understand. Nathan promised me he was investing my retirement safely. He said I was perfectly secure." Jasmine stopped hitting DeAndre and stared at her weeping mother. The horrific realization dawned on all of them simultaneously, settling over the gallery like a suffocating blanket. Nathan had not just destroyed himself, he had systematically cannibalized his entire family to fund his delusions of grandeur and his pathetic affair with Brittany. He had drained his mother's life savings to buy designer handbags for his mistress, leaving an elderly woman completely homeless. DeAndre had drained his own family accounts, trying to outrun the federal government, leaving Jasmine penniless and tied to a sinking criminal ship. Their absolute greed, their entitlement, and their insatiable need to maintain an illusion of superiority had eaten them alive from the inside out. The narcissistic family unit that had tormented me, mocked my career, and plotted to steal my grandfather's legacy was now completely reduced to a pile of screaming, sobbing wreckage on the courtroom floor. They were turning on each other, fighting like rabid dogs in a cage of their own making. I looked over at Mr. Campbell, who was quietly packing his legal pads into his leather briefcase. He offered me a small, highly respectful nod. We were officially done here. The division of assets was completely finalized by the court. I owned my supply chain tech company entirely. I held the unblemished title to my grandfather's historic estate, and I was completely free of their toxicity. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked calmly down the center aisle. I did not look back at Jasmine screaming at DeAndre or Martha sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. I walked right out of the heavy double doors, leaving the chaotic noise of their total destruction behind me. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp, bright New York morning, ready to go back to work. Before I could reach the revolving glass doors of the main lobby, Mr. Campbell caught up to me. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the pristine marble floor, echoing in the cavernous space. He held out a single crisp piece of paper clipped to a heavy wooden board. He handed me his expensive fountain pen. "The final divorce decree," he stated, his voice maintaining its usual professional neutrality, but his eyes holding a distinct glimmer of profound respect. "Judge Peterson expedited the paperwork the moment the federal agents removed your ex-husband from the premises. All it needs is your signature to make the severance absolute and legally binding." I took the heavy pen from his hand. I did not hesitate. I did not read the fine print because, unlike Nathan, I knew exactly what I was signing. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, fluid motion. I handed the clipboard back to my attorney. The stroke of a pen had legally bound me to a parasite 5 years ago, and today the exact same action set me completely free. Nathan was currently being processed in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison and a mountain of insurmountable debt. I was walking away with my company, my grandfather's legacy, and my absolute independence. I thanked Mr. Campbell for his flawless execution of our strategy and turned back toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The crisp New York morning air hit my face, carrying the sharp metallic scent of the city. But the peace of the morning was instantly shattered. Word of the spectacular courtroom implosion had already leaked. A massive throng of journalists, financial reporters, and paparazzi had swarmed the bottom of the courthouse steps. The moment they saw me, a blinding barrage of camera flashes erupted, going off like a strobe light against the gray, overcast sky. Microphones were aggressively thrust over the metal barricades. Reporters were shouting over one another, desperate for a soundbite. "Cassidy, is it true your husband was just arrested by the FBI?" A woman from a major news network yelled. "Are you facing any SEC investigations regarding the forged loans?" A financial blogger screamed. "How does this massive scandal affect your upcoming Series B funding round?" someone else demanded. I did not break my stride. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my dark designer sunglasses, and slid them onto my face. I did not offer them a smile, a frown, or a single word of explanation. Let Nathan and his family be the ones to scream and cry for the cameras. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar technology firm, and I understood the immense power of absolute silence. I walked down the stone steps, projecting nothing but cold, untouchable authority. My driver saw me approaching and immediately stepped out of the black town car, idling at the curb, opening the heavy rear door. Just as I reached the vehicle, my phone began to vibrate intensely in my pocket. I slipped into the luxurious leather back seat and pulled the device out. The caller ID displayed the name of my chief financial officer. I answered the call, expecting a frantic update about panicked investors pulling out due to the media circus. Cassidy, my CFO, practically shouted through the speaker, his voice trembling with an adrenaline-fueled excitement I had never heard from him before. "Tell me you are safely out of that building." "I am in the car," I replied smoothly as the driver shut the door, closing off the chaotic shouting of the reporters outside. "What is the current status of the board?" "The board is ecstatic," he laughed loudly. "The news of Nathan's arrest and your flawless legal maneuver just hit the financial wire. The market absolutely loves a ruthless display of corporate stability. You just proved to every single investor on Wall Street that you can systematically dismantle a massive federal fraud without letting it touch a single cent of our corporate equity. You are trending everywhere, but this time as a brilliant tactical genius. Cassidy, our company stock just surged by an unprecedented 30% in the last 20 minutes. The Series B funding round is not just secure anymore. It is completely oversubscribed. We have 3 new major venture capital firms begging to get in on the ground floor." I leaned back against the soft leather seat, looking out the tinted window as the town car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the courthouse and the media frenzy far behind us. "Book the meetings for tomorrow morning," I told him, my voice steady, but carrying a new, undeniable warmth. "I will be in the office in 20 minutes. Tell the engineering team we are moving forward with the expansion plans ahead of schedule." I ended the call and let the phone drop into my lap. The city blurred past my window, a sprawling concrete jungle of ambition and power. For 5 years, Jasmine had mocked me for being an emotionless tech robot. Nathan had underestimated me because I preferred data and algorithms over dramatic emotional outbursts. They thought my logic made me weak. They never realized that logic is the most devastating weapon a person can wield when they are backed into a corner. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the quiet, conditioned air of the car. The suffocating weight that had rested on my chest for years was entirely gone. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, I finally breathed the air of true unburdened freedom.